Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And on the one hand, this feels a little bit like catch-up, but on the other hand, I can also imagine this will wind up contentious, purely based on who I'm covering and where I landed on them, especially compared to the popular opinion. But I also say that all the time these days. I might leave it up for y'all to judge, so let's get on the pulse. So we got 6 albums on the docket here. Be sure to like and subscribe before we go on any further. But let's actually start off with, from Emma Blackery, Girl in a Box.
I'm walking with a purpose. I'll show you what it's like to get your feelings hurt. Set me up to fall. Think you're in control, but I'm taking back what you stole.
So maybe it's just me, but it feels like there's still a stigma attached to musicians who start off as YouTubers that Vine and TikTok surreptitiously got away from, which feels a lot like bullshit because you realize it might have been framed as being tied into the platform's culture, but in reality it seems a lot more like about crapping on millennial musicians who are too earnest to be tolerated by irony-poisoned Gen X critics, which then passes on to their Gen Z kids a veneer of artistic cool that has its own fine history of hollow, disingenuous bullshit. And this is all building up to the point that Emma Blackery has been making pop music at least on par with The Field, if not better, and while I was pretty cool on her EP last year, I remember really liking Villains back in 2018, a project that frankly deserved way more attention than just calling it YouTuber music, and as such, I actually had expectations for this album, even if no one else did. And it turns out those expectations were justified, because this is Emma Blackery's best work to date. Albeit with the qualification that a decent amount of this album kind of hits different for me, because she's been making content online for years now, and she might be one of the very few people who can write about it without sounding corny as all hell. But before we get into more of that, I actually want to highlight how despite some of her influences still glinting through, Churches, Taylor Swift, a smattering of Fall Out Boy, and After Laughter era Paramore for this project, I actually think this is the first time where Emma Blackery's sound is starting to feel more varied, robust, and her own. Yeah, there are a few patches where the mix can feel a little bit thin and can afford a little bit more heaviness or muscle or even just live drums to back up her voice, but hell, that was my complaint with After Laughter. And while we're in this territory, I don't really care for the Trap Experiment Strange People either. But then you get Emma Blackery covering How Soon Is Now by the Smiths and flipping it into a modern day Savage Garden track, or how Brutus echoes the darker simmer of her debut album as an effective transition into this, or how More Fool Me nails that haunted late night simmer, or how Shadowplay really earns its key change with some solid explosive presence that drives through into a fantastic closer with End of the Night. And I'm left thinking that if Emma Blackery wanted to go for pure pop rock, she would be credible in that lane. And hell, right now is the best time to do it. Now, a big part of this, following off of Villains, is how she is more willing to frame herself in darker tones and textures, mostly because she'll lean into her anger and she's much more willing to brood or swing back without playing up a character, which ramps up the stakes when she feels helpless or used or betrayed, because she's claimed way more agency in her storytelling and thus the losses actually pack an emotional punch. The majority of the pop stars, they play hero, or at the very least anti-hero, whereas Blackery is acutely aware the audience is way more fickle than that. An observation likely driven off her time on YouTube and a note of insight that often rings way too true. But as such, there's a raw, complex humanity to show both the wins and the losses, even punch back at the audience on cuts like Crying and Shadowplay, and thus frame herself as less immediately likable. And for the record, that's a positive. It's a leap in songwriting that both Pete Wentz and Taylor Swift made, and it makes Emma Blackery a much more interesting writer, and a lot more complex than just playing the bad guy or the hero that's gone astray. So with all that, the hooks are better, the writing's better, the project is varied and paced very well, and shows a real progression where I would love to see her get a more robust production budget, add a little bit more teeth and weight to her arrangements. And while I know this picked up more resonance for me because I'm also someone who has been making content online for nearly a decade, aka way too long, I still think this is a great pop album that can go toe-to-toe with anyone else in 2021, indie or mainstream. So yeah, 8 out of 10. You're probably not going to give it a chance because YouTube, but in terms of a fully fleshed out pop album, you'll miss out. You shouldn't. Next up, from Slothrust, Parallel Timeline.
People talking so much. Hold me underwater, not afraid of drowning. The light is everywhere.
Okay, context here. I was planning on covering the self-titled debut album from the band Camino, and then after 2 or 3 listens I realized I had nothing to say about mid-tier commercial core, and I realized I had to go digging for a replacement that dropped in that very same day. So why not grab the 3-piece alternative rock/emo group that wrote the theme for You're the Worst, my favorite romantic comedy TV series of the 2010s. Yeah, we're talking about Slothrust, who attract the most attention for their really solid 2014 album and their acerbically clever writing, especially early on. This band had a very 90s sensibility to go with remarkably solid production instincts, albeit one that got increasingly jagged and wonky by the time we got 2018's The Pact. But what really caught my ear on Bandcamp was their newest material, which also might be some of their best material in years, albeit going for a slight shift in sound that's playing some bigger dividends. The guitars are louder and crunchier while still containing a lot of melodic presence, especially across some of the hazier psychedelic passages. The bass lines are aggressively meaty and thick. The entire album carries a lot more swagger that adds a lot of punch to their best hooks on cuts like Once More for the Ocean, or The Next Curse, or the piano-driven Waiting, which is all amped up by the band's routinely terrific, well-balanced production, this time being handled by Billy Bush, who has primarily handled mixing and engineering for Garbage for years alongside Butch Vig, but really stepped up well here. I gotta give him a lot of props. Now, the band has gotten a bit of pushback for this album for the occasional splash of auto-tune and synth and some of the keyboards, but I'd argue it doesn't really bother me here because the textures feel more like accents rather than overpowering all the indie rock bangers, where Leah Wellbaum's desaturated but throaty delivery has a very much cool but expressive magnetism to anchor all of that explosiveness. And hey, if you want more, you can call in Lizzie Hale to scream on The Next Curse. That's an added bonus. And you really need a presence like this to sell the content, which is all thematically focused on all the possible splits and choices that they could have taken, which either shows some tentative reaches or overreaches for connection with all the best of intentions, or the fact to even be considering so many loose ends, so many alternate possibilities, parallel timelines. They have to look inwards to do the messy work of tearing down the internal barriers and then repair, even as the world seems to be burning around them and there's no higher power that's coming to help. Now, I do think this album loses a little bit of momentum in the final third, although White Rabbits is a great late album burner, and the album closer, the title track, has some really sweet vocal harmonies. But you know, for straightforward, well-balanced, and hard-hitting indie rock, Slothrust, they really delivered. So yeah, 8 out of 10. It's getting slept on. I'm kind of late to this one too, but you should hear it. Next up, from Illuminati Hotties, Let Me Do One More. I'll admit to being a little bit surprised this wound up on my schedule. I've got no shortage of punk-adjacent indie rock popping up across Bandcamp, and a lot of it runs together if the hooks aren't that strong. And going into Illuminati Hotties' debut album from a couple years back, I gotta admit it, I wasn't all that wowed. I mean, it was likable, it was reasonably well produced, it was clever in patches, but Bandcamp is overflowing with acts like this, especially when they play to a more retro style and composition like Illuminati Hotties seem to do. And I think some of that context is valid going into this project, because not only does it start off playing to a much younger vibe, it feels intentionally scattershot in a way that their debut album just did not. Maybe closer in mind to that thrown together sophomore album from last year that was made to get them out of their contract, from the rougher, tinnier, and less consistent mix, where more textured rhythms and horns, they're all thrown in, but I gotta say, the bass lines just don't have the same muscle and potency, and especially the vocals from Sarah Tudson playing up that carefree teenage vibe, be it in a bratty sneer or a hushed bedroom pop murmur. And that's kind of weird when you realize that she's a decently connected engineer and producer who's worked with Logic, Porches, Wiseblood, and Slowdive. I mean, it's probably the explanation of why she got contributions from Big Thief and Great Grandpa on this project, and yet why none of the songs are paced like modern teenage bedroom pop or pop rock, with slightly longer track lengths that often seem to unfold and sprawl a little bit more. And yet the more I delved across this album, the more that wonky clash between adolescent obnoxiousness and heavier, more adult musings and textures, it kind of felt intentional, where they're relishing the moments to cut loose for snide piss takes and a lot of goof-offs, because what the hell is adulthood worth in this late capitalist hellhole, except for how they're just growing into it, and all the hard living and hazy, half-formed relationships are actually starting to catch up to them. And look, there's that other explicit parallel to You're the Worst, especially Season 2. Just go watch the show, you'll get it if you do. But that odd sense of deflection and bone-deep melancholy might also be partially rooted in Tudson's mother sadly passing away, even if only mentioned in fleeting on the quietest tracks like Protector and Growth. And I will say, that does give the album a lot more pathos than I personally expected. That being said, when you have that in combination with how the band started, it makes the goof-off tracks feel a lot more artificial, which yes, might also be part of the point, but it's also no surprise they're the singles, where given that the band is now releasing this project through Hopeless Records, the cynical part of me knows exactly what audience that they're targeting. I don't know, it's kind of weird. In context of the album, they feel both better contextualized, but worse in execution and contrast. Which is while I respect some of the project's ideas that it's trying to go for, I get why it works. It doesn't quite click for me. Solid 6 out of 10. I think it ends really well. I absolutely think it's going to hit for a specific audience. It is worth hearing. But you know what? While I'm in the territory of disappointing people, from Magdalena Bay, Mercurial World.
How did we learn to breathe? Are we alone? Are we alive again? What do you want from me?
Well, this is a project that's been attracting quite a bit of attention. A pop duo with a flair for the retro, I started seeing a shocking amount of critical acclaim across the board dumped at the feet of this Florida duo comprised of a few former members of the indie rock band Tabula Rasa, enough that I was curious enough to give this a real chance. And, you know, for a disco-leaning indie pop act, describing Magdalena Bay is actually kinda tricky, because the palette of sound they pull from is a lot broader than you might otherwise expect. Part blocky psychedelia, where I just could not shake a Tame Impala or especially a Grimes comparison. Part woozy hypnagogic pop that's only a few steps removed from vaporwave, where of course the saxophone is going to creep in on occasion, but also part turn of the millennium dance pop in the jagged, more hard-hitting grooves and the hushed, girlish crooning. Although, you know, given some of the content, the better comparison might be some early poppy here. Now, granted, a lot of that's only in passing, and the very online, quasi-apocalyptic framing of certain songs in certain moments, where there's still a search for a dreamlike escape on the dance floor, or into fleeting love connections, most of which, as you would expect, would implode and then reform in record time, with a level of recursive structural self-awareness where the disposability of it all seems to be part of the point. And you know, I won't deny that it's a really colorful, it's a really splashy pop project, it's got some really solid grooves, and if you're enamored by what might feel like a new blend of textures, I can see why it might be a lot of blissful fun. Probably a blast on some sort of mind-expanding substance. Hell, in between all the sax solos and the occasional G-funk synth and the explosive guitar passage and simmer across domino, I definitely can hear some of that magic. It's nearly there. But with every listen, I found myself kind of cool on this, and it became remarkably easy to pinpoint why. The vocals and the percussion. In the latter case, it's conceptually the same issue I have with a lot of Tame Impala's attempts at psychedelia, and that it feels weirdly bracketed by the stiffer drum machines, where the few times we get live drums to supplement the bass grooves, it just feels way more free-flowing and expansive, which is how I tend to like my psychedelic projects. More often than not, though, a lot of the freak-out moments have this sort of bricked-out compression that really made me wonder if Dave Fridman, of all people, was on production. But then there's the vocal delivery. I get how this ironic, but not really, plastic pop cooing, I get how it's supposed to work. They're trying to hit for a very specific era that's in my nostalgia window, but more often than not, I'm left with the impression I'm just supposed to be giving into that same quasi-detached vibe, which isn't what normally grips me in the pop that I really like, where I'm drawn to more personality that tries to engage you. Look, again, I get how a blissful vibe like this can really pull you in, but either the hooks didn't dig in deeper, or some of the production foibles kept me at a distance. But while it's certainly alright, I get the appeal, just doesn't quite move me. Solid 6 out of 10. I did really want to like this more. I'll say that. And while we're in that territory, from The World is a Beautiful Place and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die, Illusory Walls.
Take my skin and make something. Burn the waste, leave my bones naked.
You know, I'm surprised it's taken until now for me to talk about this emo act, because with that band name, what else could they be? But alright, The World is a Beautiful Place, etc. They broke out in the mid-2010s as part of the growing, more mature Midwestern emo tones, notably for their multiple lead vocalists, with only their bassist, Josh Sear, as the only consistent member since the very beginning, and striking a balance between delicate, incredibly pretty, borderline theatrical and post-rock arrange passages, and more raw, jagged emo, while still maintaining a real tuneful, earnest flair that, again, almost post-rock in some of the crescendos. Now, this is their first album in 4 years, probably the reason I never got into them, given how that 2017 album wasn't all that well received, so I figured I didn't have to bother. And this is a heavy thing, clocking over an hour, and it's a project that leaves me way more conflicted than I would like. And also because while it is absolutely this band's most refined album to date, I'm just not sure that refinement is translating to the explosive catharsis that was so potent on their early albums. First off, the runtime's a bit of a misnomer. The majority of the tracks here, they're as streamlined as they come, very reminiscent of some of the pop-punk adjacent stuff that was on their 2017 album, with the last 2 tracks containing the majority of the runtime at 15 and 20 minutes respectively, trying to build for that real post-rock swell, that crescendo. That to me strikes as a bit of a misstep, where you can tell the band wanted to keep focused, a bit more accessible, but had to do something to placate the die-hard fans who were missing the shaggy extended tracks that were normally a little bit more experimental and potent. And that's kind of baffling to me, because said extended pieces at the end of the album, they're easily the most melodically interesting and also most well-written parts on the entire album. They could have just stuck with that. I gotta be blunt here, the majority of the shorter tracks, they just did not catch my ear at all, as despite a considerable refocus on complex guitar passages and riffing, this is the sort of emo-leaning indie rock that strips away any trace of an edge. It's generally fine, but it's just not all that interesting, especially as actual hooks seem to be the other thing stripped away in favor of questionable synths and vocal mixing and a lot of blockier percussion. It's worth noting that this is the first album from the band bringing inside some outside producers, and I can't say it does them any favors beyond making them sound more competent, but also a lot more colorless and generic. And it's kind of odd because unlike their earlier work, The World is a Beautiful Place, etc. seems to have gotten rid of a lot of their personal specificity in their content as well, turning more openly self-referential and confronting the primary sentiment of the band name as they look at the bleak existential paralysis of having to face the likelihood of death within a decaying body, living in an uncaring capitalist hellscape without healthcare, where how can you be inspired to change or improve your life if this is all that it's gonna be, if this is all that awaits? But even with that, the writing feels a little bit less personal, and the lack of more visceral delivery or riffs to match the language that's trying to be more descriptively graphic, that's another misstep. Yeah, it might reflect the increasingly hopeless miasma that most of the album wallows in, but when you discover that one of the band members said that they were inspired by religious alienation and Dark Souls, the lyrics make way too much sense. But you know what? Cynical realism, again, it's about the last thing I go to this band to deliver. It's a really poor fit for their earnestness. And yes, by the end of the final psalm, there's a quasi-recursive element in tearing away from the world's nightmare, finding some form of peace and togetherness, realizing you can't wallow in any sort of nostalgia, you gotta keep going forward. But I don't know, with all the build towards something that was gonna be really transcendent, the we're all in this together line, it feels like the payoff doesn't have that organic power that they previously could harness. Honestly, even as a sucker for this sort of self-contained meta-narrative, again, it doesn't work, it doesn't pay it off, there's not enough here. But overall, it just feels really drab, kind of forgettable, honest. Especially when it swings for the fences and it just strikes out. So 5 out of 10. I really did try to like this more given how much this should be up my alley, but it fell really flat. least to me. And finally, from James Blake, Friends That Break Your Heart.
Go on, say what you
Gotta be honest, I have no gauge for where James Blake's popularity is anymore. Granted, I'm not sure I ever did. I still think Overgrown is a great album, and I remember getting backlash when I was kind of mid on The Color and Anything, but paradoxically, I liked multiple songs from Assumed Form, with Where's the Catch being one of my favorite songs of 2019. Yeah, mostly because of Andre 3000, but James Blake has surprisingly good taste in rap collaborators. I will give him that. But this album... Look, I just couldn't gauge it from the singles. That went effectively from afar. I went in blind, and it's an odd listen. Not a bad one, but a peculiar one, where it certainly has moments, but I'm not sure it really works for me, and I want to start with the content here. On the surface, this is James Blake reckoning with the loss of friends. It lives up to the title. But I'd argue the central themes circle more around maintaining and reinforcing one's self-worth in the face of a town like Los Angeles that runs on disposability, and the people who will treat you and your art in the same way while saying they're friends, not helped by the isolation enforced from the past year. And I do appreciate how James Blake reckons with multiple sides of the scene here, rebuilding from putting way too much trust in people who will then abuse that trust, but also where his own miscommunications broke friendships, like on Coming Back with SZA, but also where folks have just naturally grown apart, and he kind of wishes he could have been a closer part of their growth, which comes through really well on Show Me with Monica Martin. And even if it feels a little bit detached from the album's themes, Frozen with JID and Sway shows that Blake still has his ear for great collaborations, and the few love songs we get, like If I'm Insecure to end off the album, they feel earned, genuinely pretty. So why am I so lukewarm on this? Well, some of it does circle back to James Blake himself. He's always had a very willowy presence as a singer, which makes sense for a project where you can tell that he's at his most vulnerable, but I like when he brings in his lower register with more organic foundation to his sound, and there's a lot less of that here, mostly because the pitch shifting puts him all over the damn place, and I'm not really wild about that. Never have been. Now, granted, in a lot of the arrangements, there's just less in general, especially in terms of groove. The drum machines feel increasingly spare and thin. The melodies outside of the vocal line feel increasingly minimalist and weedy. And while thankfully this album is better paced and the arranged strings are legit pretty, as a whole, the album feels very frail. I don't know, there's an insecurity to this project that is genuine, well realized, and also kind of the part of the point, but it also isn't really pulling me back for more listens beyond acknowledging what this does well. It's a valid self-care journey, to be sure, and one which I can absolutely sympathize. We've all lost friends, but the compositions are too spotty to pull me in for more. So a strong 6 out of 10. It's got its moments, but not sure it's clicking as deeply as I would like. At least for me. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe again, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine I said something controversial with at least 4 or 5 of these, so hey, comment section's down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting this channel, getting albums on my schedule, or just argue with me on Discord about this, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please do not feel obligated. It's tough times out there. I'll be okay, but hey, if you want to get part of the madness, there's your opportunity. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.